Vladimir Vetrov was, by every measure the Soviet state cared about, a success. He had been born in Moscow in 1932, a worker's son with a good head for machines, and he had climbed the only ladder that mattered in that country, Engineering Institute, then a tap on the shoulder from the one organization that could turn a bright technical mind into a career with a car, and an apartment and a foreign posting, the KGB. The Committee for State Security, the sword and shield of the Soviet Union, they put him where his talents fit. Directorate T of the First Chief Directorate, the arm of Soviet intelligence that did not steal secrets about armies or missiles, but about technology. Transistors, computers, machine tools, radar, the thousand small industrial miracles the West produced and the Soviet Union could not, and so decided to take instead. Vetrov understood the machines they were after because he was an engineer himself. That made him rare, and it made him valuable. And in the mid-1960s, it got him the prize every KGB officer wanted, a posting abroad. They sent him to Paris. For a young man from a Moscow communal apartment, Paris was another planet. He worked under diplomatic cover, running the technical side of the trade, and he moved through a city of light and abundance and shop windows full of things his own country told its people did not matter, could not have, and did not deserve. He had grown up in the gray arithmetic of Soviet scarcity, the queues, the shortages, the single sausage shared between a family, the apartment split between 3 households and 1 kitchen. His entire life he had been taught that the West was rotten, decadent, cruel to its own poor, a hollow show that would collapse under its own greed. And then he walked its streets. He saw ordinary Frenchmen, not commissars, not the connected elite, ordinary mechanics and clerks, living better than a decorated KGB officer lived at home. He saw the fullness of the markets and the freedom of the talk in the cafes, and the simple, staggering fact that here a man could criticize his own government out loud in a public square and nothing happened to him. He made contacts the way an intelligence officer is supposed to. He made friends the way he was not. French engineers, businessmen, men who did the same technical work he did but on the other side of the wall. He drank good wine with them in restaurants that never ran out of anything. He argued with them and laughed with them and learned the language until he dreamed in it. And every one of those evenings quietly dismantled something he had been told his whole life. Somewhere in those years, without ever saying it to a single soul, Vladimir Vetrov fell a little in love with the West, asked him, and fell a little out of love with the country he was there to serve. He carried both of those secrets home, and he carried them for more than a decade before either of them turned into anything. Then it ended the way these postings end, and Moscow called him home. And that is where the story of the most damaging traitor the KGB ever suffered actually begins. Not with a recruitment or a bribe or a threat, but with a man coming home from Paris and slowly realizing he could no longer stand the country he had come home to. Because Moscow, after Paris, looked like exactly what it was. Vetrov came back to a system he now saw clearly, and clarity was the worst thing that could have happened to him. He saw the corruption that ran through the KGB like rot through a beam, the fat, connected men who rose on family and flattery while better officers stalled. He saw the lying built into every report, the way everyone up and down the chain shaded the truth to please the man above them until the truth simply vanished. He had believed in the sword and shield up close for years now. It looked like a racket, and it was passing him over. Vetrov was good, genuinely, provably good. And it got him nowhere. The promotions he'd earned went to lesser men with better patrons, the sons and sons-in-law of important people, men who could barely read a technical report but who knew whose hand to shake. He watched officers he privately considered fools be raised above him because their fathers mattered, or their loyalty was louder than his. He watched reports he knew to be lies travel up the chain unchallenged because no one dared tell a superior that his prize agent's intelligence was worthless. He, who could actually judge the technology, who actually understood what was real, was ignored by men who could not and outranked by them. A second foreign posting to Canada was meant to put his career back on track, and instead it was cut short, and he was pulled home under a small cloud. Back to a desk in Moscow, his career flattening out at exactly the age when a man measures his life against everything he'd been promised and finds the account short. There would be no more Paris, no more escape, just the gray city and the corrupt service, and the growing certainty that he had given his life to something unworthy of it. He drank More each year. His marriage went cold and then bitter, and the disappointment curdled into the specific corrosive resentment of a talented man who watches mediocrity win over and over and can do nothing about it. The kind of resentment that, given the wrong access and the wrong opportunity, does not stay quiet forever. But here is the thing about where they put him. The detail that would cost the Soviet Union more than any single officer's grievance ever should have. They sat this bitter, brilliant, disillusioned man down at the analytical desk of Directorate T. His job was to evaluate. Every piece of Western technology the KGB stole from everywhere in the world flowed across his desk to be assessed. What it was worth, who had gotten it, and how. Which meant Vladimir Vetrov, passed over and simmering, sat at the exact nerve center of the entire Soviet technology theft empire. They called it Line X. Line X was the operational network. Hundreds of officers undercover in embassies and trade missions and companies across the Western world, whose only job was to acquire, by theft or purchase or blackmail or patient friendship, the technology the Soviet Union could not build for itself. Computer chips out of Silicon Valley, machine tools out of Germany and Japan, aerospace secrets out of France and the United States, radar, lasers, materials science, the guidance systems that steered missiles, and the manufacturing processes that built them. The scale of it was almost beyond belief. Whole Soviet weapons programs, whole factories, were built on designs quietly lifted from the West. Soviet engineers would receive a stolen Western blueprint and simply reproduce it, saving their country years of research and untold billions of rubles it did not have. In some cases, the Soviets were fielding weapons systems whose core technology was essentially a copy of an American or European one, stolen before the West had even finished deploying its own. It was one of the most successful intelligence operations of the entire Cold War, and the deadliest part was that almost no one in the West even knew it existed. There was no scandal, no headline, no reckoning, because you cannot fight a theft you have never noticed. The Soviets were quietly building their military and their industry on a foundation of stolen Western brilliance year after year, and they were getting away with it completely. And every name, every operation, every shopping list of what Moscow wanted next, it all passed under the eyes of a man who had stopped believing. The only question left was what a man like that would decide to do with it. For a long time, the answer was nothing. Bitterness is not the same as betrayal, and most bitter men take their grievances to the grave doing their jobs. But Vetrov's mind kept going back to Paris, to the friends he'd made there, to the sense, buried, dangerous, never spoken, that the wrong side had won inside him a long time ago. And the longer he sat at that desk, the more the two halves of his life pressed against each other until something had to give. On one side, everything he now believed, everything Paris had shown him, everything his own service's corruption had confirmed. On the other, the reality of what he did for a living, which was to help a system he had come to despise steal the achievements of a world he had come to love. Every day, he read the reports of what Line X had taken. Every day, he catalogued the West's brilliance being poured into the Soviet war machine and the Soviet economy, keeping alive a state he no longer believed deserved to live. He was not just serving something unworthy. He was, personally, one of the hands that fed it. By 1981, something in him had hardened into a decision. He would not just quit or drink himself quietly out of the service, or filed the complaints that vanished into desk drawers and changed nothing. Those were the acts of a man who still thought the system could be fixed. Vetrov no longer did. He had decided to break it. He would take the whole thing down, reach into the heart of the machine he sat at the center of, pull out its secrets, and hand them to the one power that might actually use them. And then he would go on smiling at his colleagues and filing his reports, and he would watch from the inside as it all burned. There was no way back from a decision like that. He knew it. Once he passed the first document, he was a dead man walking for the rest of his life, whether that life lasted 1 week or 20 years. He passed it anyway. He didn't go to the Americans. The CIA would have been the obvious choice, and the obvious choice was the dangerous one, the KGB. GB watched the Americans hardest of all, and a KGB officer sniffing around the Americans was a KGB officer already halfway to a cell. He went instead to the French, because the French were where his heart already was, and because he still had a way in. The way in was a man he had known in his Paris years, a French engineer from one of the big French electronics firms, a man Vetrov had once cultivated as a source and, somewhere in the process, come to like. When that engineer's company still did business in Moscow, the old thread was still there to be pulled. Vetrov pulled it. Through that contact, a message worked its way to French intelligence, and not to the service you would expect. It went to the DST, France's domestic counterintelligence, the branch whose job was catching spies inside France, not running them inside Russia. The DST had never handled an agent this deep, this dangerous, this far from home. They had never had a source inside the beating heart of the KGB. Now, one was simply offering himself, unbidden, asking for almost nothing in return. That was the first thing that made the French nervous. A volunteer who wants no money and takes enormous risks is either the most valuable source you will ever have, or a trap. They decided carefully to find out which. They could not send a trained intelligence officer to meet him. A professional spy meeting a KGB colonel in Moscow would draw exactly the surveillance that would kill them both. So the first man to carry Vetrov's secrets out was not a spy at all. He was another French engineer, an ordinary businessman living and working in Moscow who agreed, astonishingly, to act as the courier because he was the one person who could meet Vetrov without anyone wondering why two men in the same trade were having lunch. Later, a French military attaché took the role. Amateur hands passing the most professional secrets in the world. They gave him a code name. In the flat, poetic way these things sometimes land, they called him Farewell, and the tradecraft they built around him, by the standards of the great Cold War spy stories, was almost laughably simple. No elaborate spy machinery, no professional network, just a KGB colonel and a handful of amateurs passing paper. That simplicity was the genius of it, and it was also the reason the volume he produced could get so enormous, so fast. Because Vetrov did not do what spies in films do. He built no elaborate dead-drop network, no midnight signals, no miniature cameras hidden in fountain pens. He didn't need to. He sat at the desk where all the secrets already came to him, so he simply took them. Think about what that actually required, day after day. Every morning, he walked into the most paranoid building in the most paranoid country on Earth, a place built entirely around the assumption that everyone might be a traitor, where officers were watched by other officers whose job was to watch them. And every day, inside that building, Vladimir Vetrov committed treason in plain sight. He read the files it was his job to read. He noted the names it was his job to assess. And then he carried the secrets out. In his memory, in his notes, in documents, photographed and copied, past the guards and the watchers and the colleagues who thought they knew him, and he handed them to a foreign power. There was no safety net. If a single guard grew curious, if a single colleague noticed him lingering over files that were not his to linger over, if a single document went missing and was traced, it was over. Not prison, but a bullet in a basement. He knew that. He carried that knowledge every single morning through the front door, and he did the work anyway, and then he went home and drank, and came back and did it again. Whatever else Vetrov was, he was not a coward. He was a man who had decided, and who kept deciding every day at the risk of his life. He passed the material in bulk to his French contact, and then he went back to work the next morning as a loyal KGB officer in good standing. It was volume over finesse, and the volume was staggering. Over roughly a single year, Vladimir Vetrov handed the West around 4,000 secret documents, and buried in those 4,000 documents was the most damaging single thing the KGB lost in the entire Cold War, a thing no amount of counterintelligence could ever undo once it was gone. He gave them the names, not one name, not a handful. Vetrov handed the West the identities of the entire Line X network. Some 250 Soviet officers operating undercover all across the Western world, whose job was to steal technology. Every one of them, the men in Washington and Bonn and Tokyo and Paris, the front companies, the middlemen, the Western engineers and executives who had been quietly selling their country's secrets to Moscow, some for money, some out of belief. To understand what that meant, you have to understand what it costs to build a spy. A single deep cover officer represents years of training, years of patient cover building, a network of sources cultivated one careful lunch at a time. It is the work of a decade to place one good man. Vetrov handed over 250 of them in a stack of photographs, and the documents did more than name people. They laid out the machine itself, how the Soviets decided what to steal, which Western technologies they were desperate for, which ones they'd already gotten and which they were still hunting. It was a complete blueprint of Soviet weakness, a map of every place their own industry had failed and had to steal to survive. The French, when they understood what they were holding, understood something else too. This was too big to keep to themselves. So in July of 1981, at the summit of Western leaders in Ottawa, the president of France, François Mitterrand, took the American president aside. Mitterrand and Ronald Reagan did not have much in common. A French socialist and an American conservative. And the Americans had been nervous about how much to trust the new government in Paris. Mitterrand handed him a gift meant to settle the question. He told Reagan that France had a source inside Soviet intelligence, and that France would share what that source produced. The material became known in the West as the Farewell Dossier. And once the Americans read it, the entire posture of the Cold War's technology war changed overnight, because now they knew everything. They knew who the Soviet officers were, so they could roll them up whenever they chose. But they also knew exactly what the Soviets were trying to steal, which meant they could decide what to let them steal. And that is where the story stops being about one bitter man's revenge and becomes something far larger and far stranger. The obvious move was to arrest everyone. 250 names handed over. You sweep them all up. You expel the diplomats. You jail the agents. You shut it down. But the smartest people who read the dossier saw a better move. If you arrest everyone at once, the Soviets know instantly that they have a catastrophic leak, and they go hunting for the source. And the source was a man they could not afford to lose. So the West moved carefully, slowly, in a way that would not point back to farewell. France waited. And then, in the spring of 1983, France acted, expelling 47 Soviet officials in a single stroke, one of the largest such expulsions of the entire Cold War, gutting the Soviet intelligence presence in Paris in a single afternoon. Overnight, France threw out nearly the whole French half of Line X, and did it in a way that looked like the ordinary rough business of the spy trade rather than the unspooling of a single catastrophic source. That was the discipline of it. The West could have arrested everyone on Vetrov's list the day they received it. Instead, they moved the way a chess player moves. Each capture timed and spaced and dressed up to look like something a diligent counterintelligence service might have found on its own, so that no Soviet analyst, tracing the losses backward, would ever arrive at one desk in Directorate T. Other Western countries moved against the officers on Vetrov's list in their own time and their own fashion. One here, two there, a front company shut down, a trade representative quietly asked to leave. Careers ended. Sources dried up. Networks that had taken 15 years to build collapsed in months. A decade of patient Soviet spade work fell apart across a dozen countries at once, and for a long, maddening, confused stretch of time, Moscow could not understand why it was happening, only that it was, everywhere all at the same time. But the strangest use of the dossier had nothing to do with arrests. An analyst inside the American National Security Council read the Soviet shopping list, the specific Western technologies Line X was hunting for, and had an idea that was almost too clever. If the West knew exactly what the Soviets were trying to steal, why not let them steal it? Why not let them steal it deliberately, after the West had quietly altered it, so that the stolen technology would work just long enough to be trusted and then fail They ran the operation. According to the accounts that came out years later, Western intelligence began quietly salting the Soviet supply chain with sabotaged goods. Poisoned fruit hung on the exact branches the Soviets had told them through Vetrov they were reaching for. Computer chips designed to pass every test the Soviets ran and then fail once they were built into a weapons system. Turbines with subtly flawed blueprints. Chemical plant designs that would work almost right and then not. The beauty of it was diabolical. The Soviets could no longer trust anything they stole, and they had no way of knowing which of their prizes were real and which were traps, because the whole point was that the sabotage was invisible until it detonated. The most famous case was a great trans-Siberian gas pipeline. The Soviets needed sophisticated control software to run its pumps and valves and pressure regulators across thousands of miles of frozen wilderness. They could not build it themselves, so, following their own shopping list, the very list Vetrov had handed the West, they set out to steal it. And the West, knowing exactly what they were hunting, made sure they stole a version that had been quietly rewritten. Buried inside the code was a hidden flaw, a piece of logic programmed to run the system flawlessly for a while to earn the operator's trust. And then, at a chosen moment, to reset the pump speeds and valve settings and drive the pressure in the pipeline far past what the welds and joints could hold. In 1982, in the emptiness of Siberia, that pipeline is said to have failed in a single catastrophic blast. An explosion so enormous it was reportedly registered by American satellites and seen from space, described in later accounts as one of the largest non-nuclear explosions of the era. An entire stretch of Soviet infrastructure, a strategic project the Kremlin had staked its prestige on, destroyed by a secret hidden in the very goods they had worked so hard to steal. The Soviets never quite grasped in the moment what was happening to them. Their spies were vanishing. Their stolen technology was failing in ways they couldn't explain. The machine that had fed their industry for years was turning silently into a weapon aimed back at them. And the man who had made it all possible was sitting at his desk in Moscow, a loyal KGB officer in good standing, drinking too much and telling no one, watching the fire he'd lit spread across the world. He should have been untouchable. The KGB did not suspect him. There was no hunt closing in, no net, no clever counterintelligence officer pulling on a loose thread. By every rule of the spy trade, Vladimir Vetrov had gotten away with the greatest betrayal in the history of Soviet intelligence. And then, on a winter night in a parked car in Moscow, he threw it all away. Not for espionage, not for treason, but for something no counterintelligence service on Earth could ever have predicted. To understand what happened, you have to know one more thing about Vetrov. His marriage had gone cold, and he had taken a mistress, a woman who was herself a colleague from inside the KGB. By the winter of 1982, that affair had become as unhappy and volatile as everything else in his life. He was drinking heavily. He was under a pressure no one around him understood, carrying inside him the single most dangerous secret in the Soviet Union, and he had no one on Earth he could tell. Think about the weight he was carrying. He had alone done more damage to the Soviet Union than any spy in its history. He had handed away the names of hundreds of his own colleagues, some of whom would lose everything, some of whom he had known personally. He had lit a fire across the world, and he had to sit at his desk every day and pretend to help put it out, nodding along in meetings where his own superiors raged about the mysterious leak that was destroying them, knowing that the leak was him, that it was him they were hunting, even as they trusted him. There was no one he could tell, not his wife, not his mistress, not a friend. A secret like that, held alone, does not make a man calm. It eats him from the inside, and it looks for any crack to come pouring out of. On an evening in February of 1982, Vetrov sat in a parked car in a Moscow park with his mistress. They had been drinking heavily. They argued, the kind of ugly, spiraling, drunken argument that comes at the end of a bad affair between two exhausted, unhappy people. And Vetrov, drunk and paranoid and half out of his mind with a fear he could not explain and could not share, did something monstrous. He attacked her with a knife. She survived, but in the middle of it, a man approached the car, an ordinary passerby, by most accounts, a stranger who saw or heard something wrong, and came, as decent people do, to help. And Vetrov, in his blind animal panic, turned on him and killed him, a man whose name he did not know, who had done nothing but try to stop something terrible, dead in a Moscow park because he'd had the misfortune to walk past the most dangerous secret in the Soviet Union at the exact moment it broke. There was no cold professional calculation in it, no tradecraft, no espionage at all. It was a squalid, drunken human catastrophe in a parked car. A crime of passion and panic that could have happened to any violent, cornered man on any bad night. The colonel, who had outwitted the entire KGB, was undone in the end by his own worst self. He was arrested, not as a spy, as a murderer. And that arrest is the cruelest irony in the whole story. Because if Vetrov had simply driven home that night, the KGB might never have caught him at all. Farewell had not been blown. The West was protecting him. The machine had no idea he existed. He had beaten them completely. And he handed himself to them for a crime that had nothing to do with the one that mattered. He was tried for the murder, convicted, and sentenced to 12 years. And for a while, that was all it was. A KGB colonel who had done a terrible personal thing and would pay for it in a labor camp. His espionage remained his own secret, buried under the lesser crime. But the KGB was not stupid, and by now, they knew they were bleeding. Because the West's careful, patient use of the dossier could only stay invisible for so long. The expulsions, the failures, the vanishing networks. By 1983, the pattern had become too large to ignore. Somewhere, the KGB finally understood they had suffered a leak of catastrophic size. Someone with access to the whole Line X picture had given it away, and so they did what any wounded intelligence service does. They began to hunt for the mole. A mole hunt inside the KGB was a slow, paranoid, methodical thing. And a terrifying one to live through, even if you were innocent. It meant narrowing the list of who could possibly have had access to everything that had been lost, cross-checking which officers had seen which compromised operations, looking for the single point through which all of it flowed. And here was the trap that had been closing on Vetrov from the very beginning, the flaw hidden inside his own brilliance. The reason he had been such a perfect source, that he sat at the one desk where the whole picture came together, was the exact same reason that once the KGB started hunting, the arrows would all eventually point at him. The list of people who could see the entire Line X network was not long. He was on it. He had always been on it. It was only a matter of time before someone with a suspicious enough mind ran their finger down that short list and stopped on his name. Then Vetrov did the thing that finished him, the thing that turned a matter of time into a certainty. Sitting in prison for the murder, bitter and self-pitying and unable to keep his own secret any longer, he wrote, "Accounts differ on exactly what a letter, a confession, a document meant for someone, some reckless piece of writing in which he could not resist hinting at or half boasting of the enormous thing he had really done. It was the same flaw that had undone him in the car, a man under unbearable pressure, unable to hold the weight inside himself, reaching for release and reaching for exactly the wrong one. That writing found its way to the wrong eyes. And the KGB, already hunting a mole, suddenly looked at the colonel they already had in a cell, convicted of murder, conveniently in their custody, and asked a new question about him. Once they asked it, it did not take long. They pulled the thread, and the whole tapestry came apart. His access, his Paris years, and the love of the West everyone had half noticed, and no one had reported, his bitterness, his drinking, his stalled career, his exact position at the center of everything that had been lost, laid side by side. It stopped looking like the profile of a loyal officer who had committed a private crime and started looking like the answer to the question that had been tormenting the KGB for 2 years. They came for him differently now, not as jailers holding a murderer, but as interrogators facing the man who might be the greatest catastrophe in their history. And under that interrogation, the KGB's interrogation, which was not gentle, the truth came apart in their hands. The murderer in their own prison was Farewell. The man who had gutted Line X, exposed some 250 officers, blown a decade of operations, and handed the West the complete blueprint of Soviet industrial weakness, had been sitting in their custody the entire time, filed away as an ordinary drunk who'd killed a stranger in a park. You can only imagine what that realization felt like inside the KGB. The horror of understanding that the greatest catastrophe in their history had walked into their hands by accident, that they had caught, without knowing it, the man they most needed to catch, and had nearly filed him away as an ordinary killer. They'd tried him again, this time for treason. There was only ever going to be one sentence. Vladimir Vetrov was convicted of high treason against the Soviet Union, and in 1985 he was executed, shot, in the way the Soviet state dealt with those it judged had betrayed it most completely. He did not live to see what his betrayal had set in motion. He never knew the full scale of it. The pipeline, the sabotaged supply chain, the way Western intelligence would later call the farewell dossier one of the most valuable counterintelligence hauls of the entire Cold War. He died a disgraced murderer and traitor in the eyes of his own country. And for years, the story of what he'd actually done stayed locked in the archives of French and American intelligence. But the damage he did was real, and it was permanent. Some historians argue that the farewell dossier did more than roll up a spy network. By exposing exactly how dependent the Soviet Union had become on stolen Western technology, how much of its industry and its military rested on a foundation of theft, it helped convince Western leaders of something crucial, that the Soviet economy was not the unstoppable machine it pretended to be, that it was hollow, brittle, running on borrowed brilliance it could not replace, that it could be pushed and pressured and outspent, and that it would crack. Within a decade of Vetrov's execution, the country he betrayed no longer existed. And so you are left with the strange, tragic shape of the whole thing. The most damaging spy the KGB ever suffered was not turned by the CIA, not blackmailed, not bought. He was one of their own, a brilliant, bitter, disappointed officer who sat at the center of their greatest secret operation and decided, out of grievance and lost love and disgust, to give it all away. And the machine he betrayed never caught him. Not with all its watchers and its mole hunts and its enormous apparatus of suspicion. The KGB did not run Vladimir Vetrov to ground. They never even knew he was hunting them until the wounds were already fatal. In the end, the greatest spy ever run against the KGB handed them his own case in a parked car over a bottle and a knife and a dying stranger, a downfall that had nothing to do with the war he'd won. He beat the most feared intelligence service on Earth, and then he lost to himself. If a story like this one stays with you, stay with us. History is full of men who won the war they meant to fight and lost the one they never saw coming.